So, all right, welcome to the diagramming series. This is the second series or second webinar we've done in this series. Today, the focus is going to be on APIs. So, what we're going to cover today, we're going to go through again the kind of the basic principles we talked about last time for visual representation. We're going to talk through some typical API representations. We do have kind of three different formats. And then lastly, we'll go through and we're going to look at what it looks like inside IriusRisk. Provide just a simple REST API representation in there, and then talk about some ways we can maybe simplify that down depending on what our use case is for that given threat model. The runtime for today's demo, we're going to try to be done in a tight 30 minutes. So feel free to fill out that form now. Feel free to follow along. And then everything we have today, both the recording will be available as well as the project inside IriusRisk. So if you want to take that, and make edits, make changes, that will be available to you guys as well. So, all right, let's get into why visual representation matters. So, again, remember the questions we talk about. So when we're thinking through what goes on a diagram, number one, is that meaningful? Remember, it is always possible to have a very complex diagram that doesn't offer an abundance of value to my threat model, right? I can always be more complex. Sometimes being simple is better, right? What's the focus of my threat model? So, does it impact the scope? Do I need to include all relevant items? Number two, does it impact security, right? Does this representation impact the overall security of my threat model? So, today as we're kind of looking at some of the elements I've included on the more verbose version of my diagram, you'll be able to see where we could have like OWASP top 10 API vulnerabilities represented on that particular diagram. Number three, maximize returns, right? The more time I spend on things that don't add immediate value to my threat model, obviously my cost to represent goes up and my value of that threat model per time I spent on it starts to go down. And then lastly, what are expectations? So what's expected on this threat model for internal, external stakeholders, auditors, management, and obviously the goal if you're in a senior leadership position or a leadership position is to have documented expectations about what does a V1 threat model look like? What does a V2 threat model look like? How can I better communicate that to our teams? That way they understand when it's done, what is a good place to be complete on that particular model. Okay. So moving on to a couple of representations, I have 100% plundered these from the internet, right? So if you Google typical API architecture, you're going to find several of these representations. Okay. Again, here we have it's kind of a mixture of data flow plus some architecture, right? We've got very good descriptions, and you can see that the focus of this diagram is they're kind of focusing on the request, focusing on what kind of data is being exchanged. We then also have the ones that are more data flow specific, right? I have an API endpoint. Is that call authorized? If yes, is it cached? Is it malformed? And again, it kind of breaks through these different items. Now, are one of these more correct than another? I don't believe so. I believe it's perfectly acceptable to work from a data flow version of this versus a more architectural basis of this. When we get into the ones that I built for today, I'll kind of talk about the different layers in my diagram as I kind of think about them and how I break them down to achieve a very quick threat model and kind of my approach for diagramming. And then lastly, and this is the one that we're going to see maybe a little more closely represents what we have today. This was actually published by Microsoft. This is their version, kind of how they represent their API gateway. Fortunately, Microsoft, GCP, and AWS, they do purchase. If you're using one of their key services, they publish a lot of standard diagrams. So if there's ever a curiosity among, okay, how should I be representing an Azure API gateway? If you go look in the Microsoft documentation, they publish a ton of documentation around how they represent it and what is their recommended standard configuration for that service. So, there's a lot of good documents out there that help you get started, so you don't feel like you're having to do that on your own every single time. So, and with that, let's go ahead and jump over into IriusRisk. So here is my project that I've created, and here's kind of my preliminary API. Now, when I think about diagramming specifically within threat models, I like to think of this in three layers. And it's the same three layers we talk about when we think of through building templates. Okay. I have my, what I would call my environmental layer. I have my architectural layer, and I have my functional layer when I think about threat modeling. From a environmental layer, I've got my public cloud trust zone, right? I know I'm in a public cloud. Now, what I don't have represented here is this inside AWS? Is this inside Azure? Is this inside GCP? I have that omitted intentionally because, again, the focus here is going to be on the architectural layer, which is my overall layout and how things work together, and then into my functional layer, which is, what is that architecture doing, right? So not only is it an API, but it's also an API that is triggering some microservice. It's sending an email. It's manipulating and returning some piece of data, right? So as we kind of think through those three layers, this threat model is going to focus specifically on that infrastructure architectural layer, and then also start to move into that functional side. So we have our client being represented here, and I've got generic client, mobile device client, and I'll call out where we have components for these. These are default components. I have a request being made to a proxy server that is then being passed over. We have the authentication function, which is corresponding with our IDP. This is a placeholder component in IriusRisk right now. We do have several IDP mentioned, but I just included one component that would show off, several of those. So I could have grabbed a Azure Active Directory component in here if I wanted to. Oh. Azure Active Directory, which now is Microsoft Entra. We also have several other ones represented here. I think we got Okta in here as well. So several different components you could have included instead of including this IDP. We have our authentication functions, right? Depending on how your particular authentication and authorization function is proceeding inside of your API. I do have this nested inside of an API endpoint. And I do that because if I wanted to collapse this down and minimize what's being shown here, I have that ability. As I've said in previous sessions, I'm a big fan of nesting. In my opinion, I think a lot of people make their threat models very flat. That's perfectly fine, but you can get a lot more detail in here if you want. So if you even wanted to, have something inside of basic authentication, you can see I've collapsed this down just to make it fit, a little bit better in here, but you can balloon these out. So if you want to show what's going on inside of that basic authentication, you can. Now, this will kind of come in later on. Now, remember, this right here could be its own threat model, right? How does my API handle authentication across the organization? If that is done the same way in multiple environments, then I would represent this by a single component. And then this would be its own threat model, and this could be a project component or a full threat model on its own. So just kind of keep that in mind as you think about how do we represent those. I'm representing my API endpoint is attached to a server, right, with some sets of resources. They're going to be on the same server in this instance. And then I've got that API endpoint is then accessing, once authenticated, some set of resources. And again, I'm using a generic empty component here that I've used to just collect and gather, group this set of resources, right? So it could be kicking off a microservice, sending an email, accessing some type of data. And then I have that return response, right, with some data and some JSON response. And that response is being carried back into my client where my requester is. And then we also have, logging being done here. And obviously this may vary where this log is being created at, where it's being stored. So I could have other things on here like an S3 bucket or some other type of storage where this is being saved at. Okay, so again, the focus here is, what type of API is this? What's my authentication process? So you can see I've got a lot more detail in here than, we maybe need to have. If the focus is just on the API and how it's structured, I can probably start to reduce, some of the outside items with the request, where it's being sent. Obviously, I'm not going to threat model my ADP here. So I'm including a single component as opposed to what I had in the previous month's webinar, where I had the entire authentication SSO process being represented inside of that threat model. I've reduced that down by using only a single component. Now, if we think about how can we reduce this even further, Now I start getting into, I'm representing different API endpoints. I've got some proxy server here, which is maybe redirecting to, one API versus another API based on some function. And you notice the API infrastructure now is completely minimized. I'm not talking about authentication here. I'm talking about what is the function of this API endpoint, what is it doing, what's being called, what's different, right? And here's where we start getting into, I have the most verbose version, to now I'm simplifying this and I'm focusing on something very different. And my representation changes because now the net security impact is, maybe I've added access to some additional data, maybe I've added a microservice to this, and the focus is no longer strictly on how is my API being configured, but it's based on, what is it doing, right? So as I change the scope of my threat model, I can start to change the focus of what's most important, right? And then as we get into, kind of the more simplified version of this, now we've got some given API, right? And that given API is working with some set of data within this threat model, okay? Because again, and this is its own threat model. So I've threat modeled this API, and this project component very well could be this full representation up here, right? This entire thing could be summarized by my project component with what we have down here, but I've removed it from scope from this threat model. So maybe the focus here is going to be on the proxy server integration. It's going to be on the some data, what type of data is being interacted with. So you can see how, as we move between these different sections, we start to see, some of these more common, types mentioned, right? This is a little bit closer to that first one, as well as the third one here we have here, where I see, the different routing between different services, and then we start to incorporate in, some of the data flow aspects inside of here as well. Again, I in my opinion, I think a good threat model diagram should be a mixture of data flow and, architectural representation, but that's, again, my personal opinion. So with that, let me kind of pause for a second. Do we have any questions coming in on the Zoom session? Does anyone have any questions about, API representation or about any of the content we've talked through today? I know I've done a lot of talking, so I'll pause for a second and see if we have any other questions. So are all diagrams in one project? So good question. Not necessarily. My personal preference, yeah, so nesting works, absolutely. All right, so the first question there is all diagrams in one project. My personal preference is I like to have one threat model that kind of shows me my 30,000 foot view, right? And the way that could work is, imagine I've got a given trust zone, and let's just call this public cloud, right? Now I'm going to grab, let's say this is its own project component. And if I go down into my project components tray down here, I've got several of these available. So I've got my data center, I've got my web server, drag and drop that completely, right? So I've got my 30,000 foot view where each one of these might represent a different system, right? And let's call this my API server, right? Just so that I have some context. I have my 30,000 foot view, so these are each one separate threat models, but inside of this diagram, I'm able to see how each of these might interact with each other and then be able to interact with, let's say, for example, maybe I've got a public cloud, and then each one of these is then going to interact with a AWS account environment, right? So you have this 30,000 foot view where I can then start seeing how does that interact with each of these different threat models. And then as we zoom in to each of these individual threat models, and those could be what we have represented below. I have these represented on one page just because it's simpler to rotate between them than opening separate projects. But this 30,000 foot view allows me to see my entire infrastructure, maybe for a business unit or for an application, but then it reduces the scope and the overall complexity by representing each of these with a given threat model. Because as you recall, project components are full threat models that are represented, by a single component in this diagram. So if I were to go into one of these, I could then go into that source project and I can see my given data center inside of here, right? And you can see that I've done, a similar concept inside of this interface. So let's go back over into our API project. So the second question there was around nesting. And if I open this back up, I did nest that AWS in that environment. Effectively, nesting will change, a parent-child relationship with that given component inside of a threat model. So the way this works, obviously, is if I drag and drop into a zone. So if I continue using this AWS account environment, normally I've got a VPC inside of my environment. So if I go over and look for AWS VPC, I'll see that component comes up in my search. And I can nest that inside of my environment. And you see all I did was drag and drop. And as I pull this out, you'll notice I have that color change in the box to show me which layer it's being dropped into. So as I drop that VPC, this will go into the AWS account environment. And then from here, I can go in and grab each one of the different items that might go in it. So I might want to grab an EC2 instance. And again, you'll notice I drag this out. You see how I've got the color change showing me which layer I'm dropping in. So I'm going to drop my EC2 instance into my VPC. And then I can start adding in something like a database component. So we'll just do the other data store for now. And then I can start to connect those via connections to each other. So a question here from Jeff. Does nested components in your diagram affect the threats and countermeasures appear in the calculated threat model? To that end, it depends, right? So obviously your trust zone informs on our attack surface. So if I have a public cloud, for example, or a public trust zone has a trust rating of 1, meaning that it has a greater attack surface. So essentially what I'm saying with this diagram right now is if I have any threats attached to these project components, it's going to prioritize these threats over these threats because a public trust zone has a greater attack surface than the public cloud trust zone. And this is configured on a tenant by tenant basis. So some tenants may have a public cloud set of 25. I think the default setting is a value of 1. It's about equivalent to an internet trust zone. The other thing to consider is if you're using the rules engine and you've got a rule that basically says anytime a VPC is inside an AWS account environment that's managed by my organization as opposed to a default AWS account, sometimes we'll have technical controls that are already being implemented. In that case, you would have the ability to auto remediate certain countermeasures or automatically move some threats to an NA status based on your previously determined configuration. And effectively what that rule would look like is the condition would be if parent component is AWS account environment, then mark this countermeasure as implemented, for example. Let me know if that makes sense. So then another question here from George. You represent the client as being inside the public cloud together with the API as opposed to having them as internet trust zones. What would be the impact on severity scoring of threats? So in this example, the public cloud has a higher trust rating than public. So in this case, the severity, again, would be minimized. I think we kind of covered that a little bit previously in the last one. So the trust zones, right? Again, that's trust zone kind of equates to attack surface. And then, obviously change in trust boundaries. So the biggest impact there is going to be on how we score different types of threats. So as I move from a higher trust to a lower trust region, these threats are going to be prioritized over these. So a good example of this would be if I took an EC2 instance here, and then I were also to place one outside in this public cloud. If I were to update my model, and I think we can do this quickly. I'll let this finish updating. This particular EC2 instance is going to be prioritized over this particular EC2 instance. Now, the other question we get frequently is if I've got a trust zone nested inside of a trust zone, right? What does this do? These components only know they're inside of public cloud trust zone. It only sees the nearest trust zone because, right, in reality, like every public cloud is technically in the internet, right? Everything is inside the internet. The internet's just the big bad wild west of of bad things that can happen, right? So everything is technically inside the internet trust zone, but these can only see their closest proximity trust zone. I've got a question here. Is the IDP really necessary in all cases? So I presume you're talking down here. Yeah, absolutely, it's not. You don't have to include the IDP. Matter of fact, by including it in all conditions. So, for example, if I were to say something like Azure Active Directory in here, if I were to include, which is now Microsoft Entra again, I keep forgetting the name change. If I were to include Microsoft Entra in every single threat model that possibly could authenticate against it, there's the potential that I'm going to have a duplication of threats and countermeasures. So a lot of times what I recommend doing is threat model your IDP. And then anytime you bring in that IDP as a component, you only want to focus on just the integration of those items into that additional application. So for example, when we deploy Microsoft Azure, Microsoft Entra, it has now been, we're going to threat model it, we're going to deploy it securely. And then anytime I integrate with that IDP in the future, I have those integration risks that are only things I look at when I'm adding a new application, or what am I considering about the way those roles and those groups are set up, something like that, some kind of a secure by default, type of relationship. So click down on a couple of these questions here. Can you drill down from the 30,000 foot view to the last mile, and similarly, can you go up? Yeah, absolutely. So for example, this is the web server I think we were talking about. I can drill into these and I can go to that source project. My personal preference is that every single threat model becomes a project component. So I can always drill down into those different views. If I'm with a 30,000 foot, maybe that's the 20,000 foot view, right? Inside those threat models. And then I also want to show the connectivity backwards back to the high level threat model that I'm coming from, right? So that allows me to go down into the threat model as well as come back out of the threat model at the same time. Hopefully that's helpful. So click on that. If you refactor your diagram to add nesting and reorganize components around, how will this affect your threat model? So if I did have the nesting structure before, so let's say I did have the rule that said if public cloud or if parent component was AWS account environment, for example, and then anytime a VPC is inside of that, I've got some rule that automatically marks countermeasures implemented. And then your question seems like you're saying, but what if I remove that nesting and move things around? What does it do to the threats? Inside of your projects, you'll have a setting here called automatically remove threats and countermeasures that no longer apply. If you had threats and countermeasures added to that because of a nesting relationship, by having this checked, it will automatically remove those when I remove the nesting relationship. If I don't have this checked, they will persist. And the reason why we have this, say, toggle on, toggle off feature is because, let's say, for example, in version 1 of this diagram, I created a VPC, and then over time I make changes and I move things into 2 VPCs. If someone were ever to go back and look at the historic information on this threat model, I would still want to be able to demonstrate a history of compliance, a history of threat modeling on this particular project. Now, obviously, I can go through and I can create new versions of my threat model, and then I can make changes, remove things over time. Okay, say, well, that threat's no longer applicable. It's no longer applicable because I've refactored the environment. That's all perfectly acceptable. So there's several different ways I think you can handle that. So I think that answers your question, Jeff. And I'll just mark that when it's done. Already asked, can you talk about nesting? We talked about that one already. And then we did have someone, so how can we diagram network aspects such as subnets, IP configuration, firewall settings, and TLS certificates? Yeah, good question. And that might be about the last question we have before we kick back over to the survey. So if I have got IP configuration, so we do have maintained some items in here. So if you look at like Azure VNet, which would kind of correspond to VPCs and different items, we also have the ability to do, and if you want to do additional grouping, you can use empty components in here, especially for things like very specific like IP ranges. So if I wanted to show like let's do like a 10 dot, 1 dot, 1 dot X range or something like that. So if I wanted to, get very particular, and then I can start to place items inside of that, right, inside of this range, so I can nest. Let's do some generic client, right? And I can start to represent those inside of here, right? So if I wanted to separate different parts of my environment into different subnets, I could do that from here. If I wanted to do IP configurations and firewall settings, from there we do have the ability to add, WAFs into our diagram. So if I wanted to do an AWS WAF, right, I can drag and drop that onto my model, and then I can attach questionnaires to this that highlight those different settings right inside of here. So if there are specific things you want to call out about your firewall, you'd have the ability to do that on top of your diagram inside of your questionnaires. You can also append it to your diagram. So if I wanted to show that I have, and I think I have, yeah, I've got, a JSON response here. If I wanted to call out that this is an HTTP response, I could add that from here, HTTP, right? Or if I wanted to say that I had a, TLS encryption, I could add that onto my data flows. And then using these data flows, I can also stipulate that if a data flow, was like, let's say, for example, it was TLS 1.0, I could then stipulate that, hey, I've got to address that, and I need to add a particular risk pattern or a set of threats and a set of countermeasures to the source component that data flow is coming from, or from the destination component that data flow is going to. I could add that in either direction for that particular item. Okay. And I think that gets us through just about all of the diagrams. Let me go back to the chat here. Oh, appreciate you guys. You guys, it looks like you guys use both the chat and the questions. So appreciate you guys helping us out on that. So, all right. And then the last thing I want to call back out here, and I'll put this back in the chat. We would love to hear more from you guys about what you'd like to see in these, right? Like I said, one of the most intimidating things here is, representation in threat models, right? So come in here and fill out a survey. Let us know, is this going well? What format would be more useful? Yeah, Brenda, we will make the recording available online. And then if you have other topics you guys would like to see, please help us rank these so we can get what's useful out for everyone, for everyone's team. Want to make these a good use of 30 minutes for you guys in the future. Okay. And with that, I think we're right on time. So any other questions or anything else we can do? I think we had. I think that's everything. All right. Well, guys, we appreciate your time, and that puts us right at the bottom half of the hour. So we'll go ahead and conclude for the day. And I believe there will be an email that comes out for everyone who registered with a link to the recording, as well as a link to be able to download this particular project from. We have a GitHub page set up that'll contain all the project XML in here, so you guys can download those and import those in your tenants if you'd like to. So, all right. Well, everyone, we appreciate your time. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks, guys.